Welcome to the Professional Development Speaker Series sponsored by the National Dissemination Center for Career and Technical Education. My name is Raul Soto, and I am with the Ohio Department of Education, Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. Today, the National Dissemination Center is honored to have Dr. Mike Rush from the Idaho Division of Professional Technical Education. Today's presentation is entitled, "O Vision, Where Art Thou? Defining and Marketing a Vision for Career and Technical Education." After the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions. Dr. Rush.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to personally thank the National Dissemination Center for Career and Technical Education for making these series of professional development events possible. And Floyd, I appreciate your work on that and think it's extremely important for the profession. In terms of the presentation format, as you said, there'll be actually a response to this presentation. I don't think Floyd trusted me to do it right. He brought in an expert to correct any mistakes I might make, which I really appreciate. There's also a question and answer period at the end, but as we go through the presentation, there might be a comment that you just cannot resist making, and that will not offend me. So if you'd like to participate as we go through, I have no problem with that. I do encourage participation, however, and I brought from Idaho some genuine plastic Idaho potato pins. And so if you ask a good question or make an insightful comment, you can be eligible to receive one of these pins. Now remember, it has to be a good question or an insightful comment to get a potato pin. Now, for you folks out there in Webland, obviously I can't give you one of my plastic potato pins, but due to the good work of one of our folks in Idaho in the Career Information System, Terry Massatini, we do have some stellar virtual potato pins in the form of websites. And if you folks ask a particular good question or make an insightful comment, you will get access to a website that you might find particularly interesting. Another thing to mention, and for those in the remote sites, I am going to be using some slides, and so that window up in the right-hand corner of your screen, you might want to drag that and make it a little bit bigger so that you can see all the slides. And finally, I'd like to say something a little bit about web etiquette. The way this system works is there's a buffer, and the buffer creates a slight delay so that you can have kind of a continuous presentation, that you don't get a jerky voice and that sort of thing. But part of the problem is sometimes the buffer gets empty, and so the image of me will freeze. Inevitably, it will freeze on a close-up when my mouth is hanging open. Now, proper web etiquette is not pointing at the screen and say, "Oh, look, his tongue is hanging out." The proper web etiquette is to politely divert your eyes until the buffer catches up, and then go back and watch. And I know some of you haven't participated, so I thought I'd let you know how that works. The other problem with technology is that often it distorts the view of the speaker. And so I've taken the liberty to put a picture up of what I actually look like so that you can, in case that distortion occurs out there in Webland, you know what I actually look like. You know, sometimes this technology just completely cuts off your hair. Frankly, I think technology is going to change our perception and how we appreciate the world around you. I just read a story about a family who had gone on vacation, and their kids were particularly interested in the computer simulation, the Oregon Trail. And so the family decided that would be a fun vacation. So they drove out across Wyoming, and they came up to where at the South Pass there, where it's just a desolate desert area. And the little girl got out of the car and looked around very sophisticatedly. She says, "Yes, this is where my oxen always die." The topic today is, "O Vision, Where Art Thou? Defining and Marketing a Vision for Career and Technical Education." And we might ask the question why we might want to articulate a vision, or why is a vision important? And I think that the easiest way to do this, or at least one way to do this, might be to frame the discussion in a historical context. In 1914 and 1915, in the New Republic, there was a debate of sorts between prominent educational leaders, and that is David Snedden and Charles Prosser. And these two individuals, David Snedden and John Dewey. David Snedden, if you look up on the picture, go ahead and put the next one, you'll see that I pictured Charles Prosser, and the reason is because I couldn't find a picture of David Snedden anywhere on the web. But Charles was Snedden's protege and probably best known to this group as the author of the 1917 Smith-Hughes Act. And so he's up there representing David Snedden, John Dewey's up there representing himself. But in that debate, I think that a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today were raised. I will define the need for this discussion in Dewey's own words. Dewey, the need of a substitute for the disappearing apprenticeship system, the demand of employers for more skilled workers, the importance of special training if the United States is to hold its own in international competitive commerce, figures side by side with the educational need of making instruction more vital to pupils. Boy, I don't know about you, but that may have been said in 1914, but those issues sound pretty fresh. The debate was, in light of these compelling needs, there was a movement to create vocational education programs in public schools at a national by national initiative. Both Dewey were actually supportive, but all is not roses in paradise. Snedden. We have even reconciled ourselves to the endless misrepresentations, but to find Dr. Dewey apparently giving aid and comfort to the opponents of a broader, richer, and more effective program of education is discouraging. Dewey. Sir, I have written unclearly indeed when Dr. Snedden interprets me as giving, even in appearance, aid and comfort to the opponents of a broader, richer, and more effective program of education. But in the name of a genuinely vocational education, I object to the identification of education with acquisition of specialized skills in the management of machines at the expense of industrial intelligence based on science and a knowledge of social problems and conditions. The key issues in this debate focused on three things: content of vocational education, the purpose of vocational education, and control of vocational education. First, content found Snedden and Dewey in agreement. Both of them agreed on the value of work as an educational tool. Back to Dewey. In these places, the aim has been to borrow from shops the resources and motives which make teaching more effective and wider in reach. Snedden. Vocational education at the right time and of the right kind is supremely important. They disagreed, however, on the other two, the purpose of that education. Snedden. Vocational education is irreducibly and without unnecessary mystification education for the pursuit of an occupation. Dewey. But every ground of public policy protests against the use of the public school system which takes for granted the perpetuity of the existing industrial regime with all its antagonisms of employer and employed, producer and consumer. I object to regarding as vocational education and training which does not have as its supreme regard the development of such intelligent initiative, ingenuity, and executive capacity as shall make workers, as far as they may be, the masters of their own industrial fate. And finally, they disagreed on control. According to Dewey, the issue at stake is whether a sharp line of cleavage shall be drawn as respects administrative control, studies, methods, and personal associations of pupils between schools of the traditional literary type and schools of a trade preparatory type. And then finally, Snedden. Businessmen generally are suspicious of the so-called academic mind in connection with vocational education. They feel assured neither of the friendliness nor of the competency of our schoolmasters in developing sound industrial education. For that reason, they often favor some form of partially separate control, at least at the onset of any new experience. Now, I don't know about you, and that may be somewhat different than what we're used to hearing today, but the issues sound pretty fresh. How can career technical education contribute to the economic vitality of our nation and equally to the enhancement of opportunity for its citizens? This debate is clearly important today, and in fact, I think may be more important today than it was in 1914. The contributions of any enterprise, and in this case career technical education, is tied to its ability to define itself and identify its mechanisms for effecting results. Defining something also allows resources to be assigned to that activity. Frankly, I don't think career technical education, at least recently, has done a very good job in answering those questions posed. In many ways, our leadership infrastructure is not very cohesive or very strong. Our teacher education programs, in some cases, are contracting across the nation. State directors often have a fairly high turnover rate. We have a situation in which there's kind of a vacuum, in some cases, of leadership. On the other hand, improvements in programs across the United States, new innovations, the demand for career technical education has never been better or higher. There's an incredible amount of synergy and activity at the local and state level, and that begs for some national support, if nothing else. It was to this end that the National Association of Career Technical Education of State Directors of Career Technical Education felt it critical to articulate some sort of vision for career technical education. And we determined that the first step was to define the key characteristics of professional technical education. And so we went through a process that was actually stretched over a several-year period. We reviewed work done by other entities, the Office of Vocational and Adult Education in the paper that was penned by Richard Lynch. Materials developed through the National Dissemination Center were reviewed. State efforts, of which there were some tremendous, including those right here in the state of Ohio, were called upon. And other groups and entities, such as the Hudson Institute's Workforce 2020, materials from the National Governors Association, materials from the State Chief State School Officers Association, and finally concepts from initiatives like School to Work and Tech Prep and high schools that work were drawn upon. The state directors then created some focus groups at one of their conferences. They dedicated the entire conference to the development of a vision paper. And in fact, the person that was in charge of that, Joe Keister, is sitting right in the audience, had a tremendous amount to do to organize that and get us off the dime in terms of organizing this development of a vision statement for career and technical education. And then finally, I draw the short straw and was asked to draft the note. Draft the document, and I think that's why I'm here today. The guidelines for development were first that this statement addressed the entire scope of career technical education. Everything from middle school exploration to secondary programs to post-secondary programs to short-term training, this statement was to try to encompass the entire field of career technical education. Secondly, we determined it ought to transcend immediate issues, not what is the latest flavor of the month in terms of legislation or pet project, but that this would transcend those kinds of issues. Thirdly, we focused on defining the uniquenesses of career technical education. Not just how career technical education was the same as everything else, but what it brought to the table that made it different and valuable and useful. And finally, we tried to limit this statement to as few principles as possible, with the idea that if we could capture the essence of career and technical education in as few principles as possible, we'd had a better chance of communicating that across the nation and to various constituent groups. The components of the document, and the document itself looks like this. This is for the folks here, and I think there's a picture on the website as well. For the folks here, we actually have copies for you. For those folks on the website, there is an address at the bottom of this that can tell where you can print out a copy of this for yourself. But this is the document, and essentially it's divided into two pieces. The first is the premise, and the second piece are 5 principles. The premise first identified a name. You might want to think that's sort of self-evident, but let me tell you, coming up with a name to describe this enterprise was not a simple task. We talked about vocational education and career education and school to work and workforce education and all the different professional technical education and all the different names that this enterprise has been called across the United States. But we found it critical that we agree on a name to call this, because it's very difficult, once again, to direct resources if you call it 15,000 different things. So we agreed on career technical education, not necessarily because we all thought that was the very best name, but we thought that it had the most cachet, if you will, that it was the most accepted across the nation. Secondly, we identified the scope, and I already described that scope as middle school to short-term customized training. We thirdly identified the purposes or functions of career technical education. We decided it had three broad functions. First, to provide technical job skills. Secondly, to provide cross-functional skills like problem solving and communication skills, the ability to use information. And finally, we said it had a purpose as a context for enhancing general education. So those are the things that the premise addressed. And then we created 5 key principles, which essentially began with "we believe that." The first principle was that we believe career technical education draws its curricula, its standards, and its organizing principles from the workplace. In my opinion, this principle, probably more than any other, differentiates career technical education. It defines how it is different from the rest of the educational enterprise. There are essentially 2 primary sources of curricula in our public and private schools at this time. The first is the discipline approach, and the second is the profession and or occupation approach. The characteristics of a discipline-driven curricula include, first, it's supported by the academic infrastructure. In other words, if you go over here to Ohio State University, you will find majors in social science and history and physics and chemistry and English. You also find that disciplines are supported by awards. If you look at the Nobel Prizes, for example, you'll find prizes in chemistry and physics and mathematics. It's supported by conferences. Most academic conferences are organized around a discipline. It's supported by theories, and most standardized tests are developed based on a discipline-based approach. You have a math section and a communication or an English section. Secondly, a discipline-driven curricula forms the basis of most of our academic standards. Those standards are developed by disciplines. It builds to a more in-depth study within the discipline. Mathematics at the first grade level eventually leads up to mathematics at the PhD level, and we build on that as we go through the curriculum. Its integration with other disciplines is not a primary focus in discipline-driven curricula, although it's receiving increasing attention. But most of the colleges that it's at the university level in which it's receiving attention tend to be vocational colleges, i.e. colleges of business in those areas. Its application is secondary. The primary purpose is to learn the particular principles in the discipline. And finally, motivation to learn is intrinsic. In other words, we learn the information because we want to become smarter. We want to know what kind of information is presented in that particular discipline. The characteristics of a profession or occupation-driven discipline are somewhat different. First, it's driven by the workplace. Standards are drawn from the workplace requirements. It builds to a higher level participation within an industry or a career path. It combines knowledge from various academic disciplines. I think this is a really important one. Have you ever wondered why almost all of the conferences, all of the initiatives, all of the activities with regards to integration are driven from career technical education, not the academic side? I'd like to think that that's because we're morally superior and naturally gifted intelligently, but I suspect that may not be the case. The reason that most integration is driven from career technical education is because it's part and parcel of an occupation-driven curricula. In other words, if you're going to become an electronics a person that works in the IT field, you have to be able to write manuals and communicate effectively. You have to be able to do mathematics. You have to be able to do the technical skills. In other words, you cannot hire a person in that area that cannot integrate both the academic and the technical skills together. And so integration is naturally driven from career technical education almost all the time because it's a fundamental premise of what an occupation-driven curriculum is like. Application is primary. In other words, the reason we learn this information is so that we can do something with it. And finally, motivation to learn is extrinsic. Once again, the reason we learn the information is that we need to know the information so we can perform this particular task. Some implications of these two types of curricula. First is that both types of curricula are important. I am absolutely convinced that discipline-driven curriculum and occupation-driven curriculum are necessary. There isn't one that is superior enough to take over the entire educational system. I think we need both. I think, secondly, that the cultures in those two environments are different enough that both require structures for advocacy. In other words, I think we need people in career technical education. We need structures to fund and encourage and to motivate that sort of education. And thirdly, both demand specificity. Part of the problem, I think, that we've had in creating a vision for career technical education has been that the debate goes like this. If we offer, as part of our educational continuum, kids job-specific kind of skills, we are depriving them of general transferable skills. In other words, Dewey's desire to make them masters of their own destiny. Now, that may have been true back in Sneddon and Prosser's day, and is true in individual technical programs today. But I don't think it is a prerequisite of career technical education. In-depth study does not in and of itself mean less transferability. Now, let's take some examples. Think back on your most interesting course or program that you participated in. Let's just take college, for example. Was it that freshman level survey course that you took? Or was it maybe that junior or senior level course where you really got into the meat of it? And say your methods course where you got to practice things. Which class was more interesting, and in which class did you develop more transferable problem-solving skills and communication skills? Was it the survey lecture class, or was it the in-depth specific class? Another example, if you look at the music education field, certainly people wouldn't say music education is vocational, but I'll tell you what, the kinds of practice that people go through to become an accomplished musician look awfully repetitive to me. And certainly if we advocated that kind of education and rote memorization in career technical education, we would be set as severely limiting the skills of those students. But the facts are, students who perform well, who spent hours and hours in a very narrow area of becoming accomplished musicians, actually perform better academically than those students that don't. And the research expands across IQ levels. Problem solving requires problems. Real live problems. And you don't get to that level until you get to specificity. It's in the specificity that creates the motivation engagement that turns intellectual activity into experience that fundamentally changes our thinking and our behavior. In my opinion, it's this concept that has the potential of bringing those two philosophies of Dewey and Sneddon together. That education drawn from the workplace can both develop job skills, put people to work, enable them to succeed, and enhance learning in general. So that brings us to our second belief, that career technical education is an integral component of the total educational system. We believe that career technical education can benefit all students. It does not benefit all students in the same way. It can benefit students who are pursuing careers requiring specific technical skills of less than a 4-year baccalaureate degree nature. It can benefit students who are pursuing degrees, careers requiring a traditional 4-year or more degree. Regardless, it prepares students for the next level, either the next level in terms of their work environment or the next level in terms of their educational experience. Secondly, we believe it's an integral component of the total educational system because it contributes to broader educational goals like high academic achievement, student retention and motivation. In fact, at the Tech Prep Conference a couple of weeks ago, one of the statistics that our folks brought back said that students who enrolled in career technical education, at-risk students who enrolled, were 8 to 10 times less likely to drop out of school. A tremendous force for retention and motivation. And finally, the development of general workplace and life skills. We also believe it's an integral component of total educational system because it connects education and work. And it may be in this particular belief where we wrestle with the issue of control. If career technical education is an integral part of the total educational system, do we need to have it separately identified at all? Does calling a student, for example, a career technical education student, make any sense? In the view espoused by Snedden and Prosser, where there's a population of students best suited for this kind of training, and we got to identify who those students are and then give them it, the answer is probably no. Career technical education, as our belief says, benefits all students. In the sense, however, that we identify students to target resources and realize the benefits of career technical education, I think the answer is yes. After all, we often identify students as music students or debate students or athletes without presuming that they are not math students or incapable of writing an essay. Career technical students can be identified. We can target resources. We can create an infrastructure that mines the benefits of this enterprise without limiting student options. If you'll forgive me, one of my background issues, part of my background is agricultural, and so I'm going to use an agricultural example, and so the rest of you are just going to have to bear with me. Darrell, however, will appreciate this. The facts are, if you're raising cattle, you know that crossbred cattle are more vigorous and produce more meat. The question is, why deal then with purebred cattle at all? And the answer is, well, you cannot get to the latter without maintaining the former. It is important that the career technical education community carefully define itself and make sure it's bringing its best to the table. Discipline-driven curricula and workplace-driven curricula both provide unique and powerful genes, if you will, which when combined produce a more vigorous and thorough education. The third belief that the directors came up with in terms of the vision and the key principles is that career technical education is an integral component of the workforce development system. It seems that an occupation-driven curricula, that this would be self-evident, but it may be in this area where we've done the worst job of all. With all our emphasis on the reformation of education, we've forgotten that career technical education is one of the most powerful tools our country has for creating a thriving economy. In some cases, I think we've relegated that task to the Department of Labor programs, which only target unemployed or high-risk youth. In this particular belief that career technical education is an integral component of the workforce development system, we believe that it provides curricula tied to workplace requirements. It enhances the interaction of education and work. It requires, however, better partnerships. I'm often dismayed by the lack of interaction from the career technical education community with the other workforce development partners. And I have to say, in Idaho, I think this is an area we have really worked hard on, creating an infrastructure where the governor and the Department of Labor and the State Board of Education can work together. In fact, in Idaho, the chair of the department or the State Board of Education is also the chair of the Governor's Workforce Development Council. And so we have a unique opportunity to collaborate, and we've been able to do so without compromising the integrity of either the workforce or the educational programs by creating an environment where these programs can work together. I think it's important to recognize that we need to create some monolithic, overreaching bureaucracy to combine these programs. In fact, most of the time that works against you because we're trying to work with educators who often have a very significantly different mandate and mission. And so by creating structures in which we can collaborate, I think we get further down the road. The fourth principle is that we believe that career technical education maintains excellence through standards, accountability, and high expectations. I think this has often been a sticking point with career technical education, i.e., if you have a student for which you have low expectations, then you ought to send them off to career technical education program. And conversely, if you have a student for which you have high expectations, you ought to keep them away from such programs. And I think that this has created a tremendous problem for the career technical education community because it is not consistent at all with the profession nor the community in which we put our students. High standards means we focus on workplace standards, which mean both the academic and the technical standards necessary for those students to succeed. It involves industry certification as a component of that, continuous improvement, and finally the preparation and deployment of qualified teachers. The final belief that we developed was that career technical education is robust and flexible enough to respond to multiple educational environments, customers, and levels of specialization. Frankly, career technical education is a complex system. We deal with multiple levels of education. We deal with multiple educational environments, which are often very different. We deal with multiple customers, and finally, we deal with multiple levels of specialization. Let me just review some of the system elements that the directors developed. Career technical education does the following things. It integrates career exploration. It provides tools for organizing curricula. It facilitates the teaching and use of technology. It's integrated into the total learning experience. It enhances the learning of academic subjects. It teaches broad occupational skills. It also provides job-specific training. It includes all aspects of the industry. It teaches how to balance family and work responsibilities. It's offered at multiple levels of the educational through a variety of educational environments. It responds quickly to changes in the economic environment. It requires comprehensive career guidance to provide students the information they need to know what courses to take. And finally, it does serve students with special needs. That complexity mitigates against our being able sometimes to articulate a clear vision of the enterprise of career technical education. Someone listening to a person designing a program for training firefighters, for example, may not much have in common with the person trying to find out how to motivate students to stay in school and focus on taking the right courses. But frankly, I think that's something the career technical education community has got to recognize and we've got to deal with. So that brings us to the conclusion, i.e., where do we go from here? In my opinion, the career technical community needs to come together on major issues. We don't need to agree on everything. And I think if we insist that we're going to have to agree on everything in order to come together at all, we're never going to make it. I think the community has to come together on major issues. I think we need to develop leadership with good philosophical and educational credentials, and I commend particularly the state of Ohio and the National Dissemination Center for developing a leadership development academy, if you will, to help to develop and foster leaders in professional technical education. I think we have to develop a leadership strategy, and I think that strategy needs to have the following components. First, I think we have to identify who we want to serve. Although career technical education is beneficial for all students, we don't serve everybody. An enterprise cannot serve everybody and do everything and still be a differentiated enterprise. We have to identify our customers and decide how we're going to serve them. And we have to identify those not based on what we'd like their needs to be and have that fit what we can offer, but we have to identify what their genuine needs are. One of my favorite stories, and some of the folks I know watching the webcast have heard this, so I apologize to them, but it's a guy from Texas who goes to England to visit. And because he's a Southern Baptist, he thinks it might be fun to go to church and see how the English churches respond. Well, the thing he's struck by is the formality of the service. Everybody stands up when they're supposed to, sits down when they're supposed to, and there's no noise in between. Well, finally, the Texan's sitting there, and the pastor says something he really agrees with, and he just can't resist. He shouts out, "Amen!" Every eye in the congregation turns to where this man's sitting, and pretty soon you have the usher rushing up and talking to the man. He says, "You must not talk out loud in this church." "But I've got religion." "Well, you didn't get it here." I think sometimes our institutions become so wrapped up in being institutions and protecting them that we forget to evaluate and remember that we're out there to serve a felt need, and we've got to identify that need, and we've got to meet it accurately. Secondly, I think we have to create a clear vision, and that's what I think this presentation has been about, the Directors Association effort, about trying to lay some groundwork for a vision that we can all buy into as a career technical education community. However, we need to go further. The next thing I think we need to do is create a compelling case for our enterprise. We have to identify the specific needs and then explain how career technical education can meet those needs better than any other enterprise. We have to have a comparative advantage, in other words. We not only have to be able to meet the need, but we've got to be able to do it better than other alternative modes of operation. Fourthly, I think we need to develop accountability. I think that anything that seeks to become funded or supported must be accountable to those people who have to support it. Next, I think we have to adopt what I call persistent collaboration. There's a lie out there that goes something like this. You know, if you'll just work with other people and cooperate, your life will be made easier. That is not true. If you work with other people and collaborate, your life will be harder. It is much simpler to go in your office and close the door and just do it than to go out and try to get everybody's buy-in on getting it done. The flip side of this, however, is that if you collaborate and cooperate, it's almost always better for the end receiver of the services. And so that's why I say I think we have to adopt a notion of persistent collaboration, because unless we're persistent at it, we will quit before we get the benefits. And then finally, I think we have to be realistic in that we have to adapt our strategies to the political context. And I think career technical educators and leadership has been somewhat naive in this particular area, particularly at the national level. Let me give you an example. I think we all go to Congress and we're sold out on our little particular notion of what career technical education ought to be. And so we go to sell our little particular set-aside or a particular little notion, and we do that naturally by saying, but it works better than all these other pieces. And then the next person goes and sells their particular notion, and they say, and it works better than all these pieces. And the next person goes and sells their particular notion and says, it works better than all these pieces. Well, what do they hear? That this notion is good, and that this notion is good, and that this... No, what the politicians hear is that nothing works very good. Because we've had 3 people tell us that all these pieces don't work very good. Now, granted, they've said one little component worked all right, but the concept and the political realities is that if we can agree as a career technical community, particularly when we're looking at national policy, federal legislation kind of issues, we are not going to be successful. And in fact, I don't think career technical education has been very successful at the national level. The amount of funds going into Perkins, for example, even if you add all the funds into School to Work and Perkins and Tech Prep and put everything in a big pile, have not increased nearly as rapidly as support for, say, Title I and some of the other educational programs. And I think we've done partly that for ourselves, to ourselves. We haven't identified a career vision, and then we haven't articulated that in a vision in a way that policymakers can create policy at the grand policy level. Now, that doesn't mean we have to give up our passions, but it does mean we have to set aside some of the details while we work on broad philosophical issues. So that brings us back to the beginning. O vision, where art thou? Although Dewey lost the debate back in 1917, I do like his quote where he said, in short, he describes the system he'd like to see. He says, in short, a complete educational system, preserving the best in the old and redeeming the heritage by lively association with studies, methods, and teaching representing our newer social needs. It's our hope that these key principles that I've articulated today form the first part of a vision for career technical education, and that we can realize that goal of a complete educational system. With that, Daryl, are you next on the agenda for your responses? All right, well, I'll sit down and let you get after it.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to Ohio. It's nice to have you be with us and to hear your views on a vision for career and technical education. And I want to applaud the state directors for taking on this particular task. My assignment today is to kind of react to your presentation.
Present to the camera.
I don't know. They told me to do it at the table. What do you want me to do? We need some clarification here. You want me to do it here, or you want me to stand up? Stay right here. Turn around, okay.
What we need here, Daryl, is some specific job training. You know, we need some specific skills here.
We need some orchestration.
Yeah, that's right.
But we'll stumble through it. But as I was saying, my task today is to react to your presentation within the framework of comments, elaboration, cautions, and maybe even some challenges. Your topic today, I think, is extremely timely and important to career and technical education's future, because a vision is a clear image of what a movement could be or should become to realize its full potential. I think it was Yogi Berra who said once, if you don't know where you're going, you'll most likely end up somewhere else. And I think a clearly defined vision that, in your own words, defines what career and technical education is about is extremely important as we move forward. I thought for a long time that without the benefit of a clear vision, sometimes we become reactors to someone else's vision. And oftentimes when federal legislation is passed, that legislation wasn't based upon a clearly defined vision that the leadership had for career and technical education, but it was somebody else's vision, and then we scurried around to figure out how we could adapt to it and best accommodate it. So this notion about a vision is not just an academic exercise. I think it's extremely important to the enterprise and should become top priority in terms of career and technical education realizing its full potential. I really like the basic principles that you reiterated in your comments because I think they're a good starting point for framing that vision. But as you noted toward the end of your comments, there's a lot of work to be done yet, because those basic principles are kind of characteristics of what career and technical education is like, but they do not clearly establish what it is in terms of an enterprise or in terms of an entity. I agree with your inclusiveness notion, because we're talking about a program that does not know any particular ability level, does not know any particular physical challenges that students may bring to the classroom, does not know anything with regard to gender, because it is an inclusive program and must serve all students. So I think that, from the standpoint of those basic principles, you're on a solid foundation. While I agree with your notion that the curriculum in a career and technical education enterprise is driven by the occupation, I'm not so sure that that's always practiced as religiously as what the theory might suggest. I think particularly in the era of educational reform, we've compromised some of our beliefs in order to fit into that larger structure, which was not necessarily driven or led by people who were sympathetic to career and technical education, but perhaps driven more from the academic side of the equation. The caution I would offer you in terms of pursuing this task is one of being able to deal with the external forces that would tend to want to constantly play upon shaping this vision. And I'm talking about forces such as and you mentioned one in your comments, the Hudson Institute and the likes, who sit around a table in Washington and theorize about how the world ought to be, and sometimes lose touch with how the world really is in regard to the kind of students that we are addressing. I'd also caution you to figure a way to deal with the pressures of school reform that aren't necessarily sympathetic in many cases to the cause of career and technical education, and also to the force of political expediency. You commented on that, and it's one that's very real and one that will have to be dealt with. I guess a challenge I would offer you is once you get this vision statement crafted, how are you going to be able to transcend the legislative and the policy making bodies, the state level leadership, the total educational community, to cause them to rally around this mission in terms of the importance and the significance that it has to the future of this economy. This notion about adapting to the political arena is certainly one that you have to strategize, and also it's also important that this vision provide that compelling case in terms of getting the resources and the kind of policies that you need to move this enterprise forward. There's some questions sometimes about, well, where does the vision come from? Well, I think you're right on target. I think it has to come from the discipline, and it seems to me that based upon the current structure we have, it's going to have to come out of the state director's leadership. And so carry forth, Mike. I think that you're on a good pathway. I certainly think you've got a challenge ahead of you, but it's one that has to be done. And I applaud you for the effort that you've taken so far.
Daryl Parks, for those of you who might not know, is a former state director of career technical education. In fact, one of the foremost of the former state directors, a tremendous leader that I remember when I was a young professor at Penn State University. We invited Darrell to come and speak to our faculty because he was considered at the time one of the foremost leaders in career technical education, and I think he's maintained that stature. And so, frankly, I feel much more important because he got to react to this discussion. The bottom line is, Darrell, your comments do warrant a potato pin there. So there you go. I appreciate that. At this time, we'll respond to questions from either the web audience or the audience here. Barbara.
Yes, I have Ken Hoyt on the chat room.
No, he doesn't get asked questions.
He's not asking one. He's making a statement.
Oh, okay. Well, he can certainly make it a statement.
He says, Mike, your definition of career and technical education sounds like a combination of career ed and voc ed. That's okay, provided it doesn't replace career ed.
It wasn't a question. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I liked your talk. I think it was very good, and I was motivated to ask a question because I want a potato pit.
Well, right, good. Yes,
I've
absolutely.
never had one before.
I believe in incentives, no matter what it takes.
But I want to ask you a question about your basic premises. When you describe discipline-driven curriculum, you say that the motivation is to learn. When you described occupation-based curriculum, you said the motivation to learn is more extrinsic, if I caught the terms correctly. I think if you were to ask someone in chemistry why they're taking chemistry, they certainly want to learn, but they think they're going to work as a chemist. If you ask someone who's taking math, they think they're going to be using the math in their careers in some fashion or the other. So I sense that premise is sort of dividing something that may not be quite there, and I suspect that if you ask people in those discipline-driven curriculums, if they would respond to that quite differently than you characterized it. So I would ask you to respond to that.
Obviously, whenever you try to create some differentiation, you're going to gloss over a lot of the realities. And what I was trying to do with those two characteristics was trying to draw what made them different. There's obviously probably more that makes them the same, and I think you've drawn a good analogy there. One of the issues that I think, if you think back in still today, if you are in a classroom and a student asks their teacher, why do I need to know this particular principle? Generally, the response is not very well formulated and often ends up being, well, because you'll need it in college. That response is different generally in a career technical education class. And that's why I was trying to articulate that difference between the motivation. In career technical education, I think it is clearly because you need this skill to be able to do something else. And but I agree with you. And that becomes part of the articulation or the integration of the academic skills. You're going to have to know all that.
Shouldn't learning always be highly intrinsic as well as extrinsic? I think when you draw that, you could raise some hackles in other communities.
Should, ought to, but not necessarily will. And after all, I brought potato pins to get responses. So for that, you get one. Any other questions?
If this is on, I have a question. First of all, Mike, you didn't just draw a short straw. You were selected by your peers, and we're very grateful for the work that you did on this. But the real challenge is in the implementation. And can you speak to what you think the priority should be to actually implement the vision, the work, that is, that Darrell alluded to as well?
Well, I think that there are a number of activities that have got to get done. First, I think that these sorts of activities that we're doing here today are important because I think that we need to present this vision and the next iteration, the completeness of that, as Daryl pointed out, to as many different groups and in as many different settings as possible so that we develop that consensus, and not only develop a consensus, because I think in some cases leadership just has to step up and say, this is the way we're going to do it, because if you don't, you never get anywhere. But regardless of how we get to that vision, we need to get as many people on board as possible. The second step is I think we need to work closely, at least at the federal level, when we're looking at reauthorization or development of new federal legislation. I think we need to work closely with the Office of Vocational and Adult Education to, as a community, direct the next iteration of federal influence in professional technical education or career technical education. The federal legislation has always been an important driver of what we actually implement. Although I think some of the best innovation has actually occurred at the state level with state initiatives using state money, I think in terms of a national rollout, that federal legislation has always been really critical to us. And so I agree with Daryl. I think too often we have waited until somebody else came up with the legislation, generally based on a whole series of specific narrow needs that individual groups had. And when I say that, I'm not saying these groups have needs that aren't true and need to be met, but that's not a very good way to craft an overall vision for career technical education. And so I think we have to work very closely with those folks up front, that the leadership needs to work on that, so that we can craft a piece of legislation that really embodies a broader vision. The other thing I think we have to do is that the career technical education community has to document our performance and to communicate that performance more effectively to those in the policy-making roles. Data drives decision-making, and I think that our community has not been very good at pulling that data together and presenting it in a coherent way. And the excuse we always use is that, well, we don't have some national database. Well, folks, we aren't going to have a national database for a while. And so what we have to do is there are lots of ways to collect data and to assemble it and to organize it in ways that tell a single story without having a single national database collection system. And so that's part of what I think we need to marshal the resources, and I think the national centers have done a particularly good job. In fact, this last paper that I just read that just came out on the environmental scan, I thought was particularly good at identifying some real successes in career and technical education. And it's that sort of thing that I think we need more of. I think we also need to, at the state level, need to be agreeing on and working on implementing and supporting a vision that other states agree to. I think too often we tend to get too competitive and say, well, the way our state configures this is so much better than the other states that this is the only one we're willing to accept in terms of our promotion and our support and our energy and our money. And I think, frankly, that we lose a lot of the synergy that we could get when we adopt that particular point of view. I mean, even the name debate has been painful for a lot of people. Obviously, the right name for career technical education is professional technical education, like we have in Idaho and Oregon. But, you know, people just aren't there yet. And so we have to, have some compromises, if you will. That didn't answer your question, but at least it got at some of the principles that I think we have to focus on. And certainly, it was worth potato pin. I've got lots more, folks, so you don't hold back. Yes.
Comments. First,
wait, are they insightful comments?
Yes.
Oh, well, then, okay.
Of course they
Good.
are. My God.
Comments don't qualify for potato pins. They have to be insightful.
Well, actually, you can assess whether or not they're
see.
insightful. I don't know if you have criteria or not.
No, Floyd's the judge for the
okay.
insightful. Yeah.
Okay, my two comments. First of all, a very quick commercial for one of the projects within the National Dissemination Center, which focuses on identifying exemplary career and technical programs across the nation, because the ones that we have identified so far do reflect the vision that you have put together with the state directors. And I'd like to tell people that those programs are really out there, and they're doing wonderful things, and they do have the data to support them. And if you're going to ACTE, you can meet those folks at several different points during the conference. So there's my short commercial.
So that comment, you have to get Floyd to give you a potato pin.
Okay. Number two, I'm really interested in where you're headed with this issue of benefiting all students. Back when we were arguing about school to work, and all means all, meaning we're really going to look at serving all students with career-focused education, that hit a lot of very difficult barriers among a lot of groups who felt very threatened by that kind of positioning. But I think that we've gotten past a lot of that, and I think that our real challenge now, like Joe was alluding to, is in the implementation. I don't think we can do a very good job job of providing some kind of contextual and or career-focused education for all students, given the current very traditional delivery system that we have in the United States for 9th through 12th grade education. I think we have to look at radically different delivery models to be able to collaborate with those academic folks, and I think that seeing them as the enemy or competing with them is a war that we will lose very quickly and very soundly. I think that we need to be very cognizant of the benefits that we each bring to the table, that discipline versus curricula debate, and think about ways that we can truly collaborate, not just within occupational specific programs, but across the entire curriculum, so that those students in chemistry aren't taking chemistry simply because they might need it in college, but when they take chemistry, they understand how it relates to a myriad of careers and industries, and it becomes relevant for them, and they have more of a motivation to learn than just because it's on the ACT or the SAT.
Well, that definitely was an insightful comment, worthy of a potato pit. In fact, you may even want two, because you might want to give one to your friends. There's a couple of comments. One, I don't think career technical education will serve all students. I think there will be a percentage of students that will opt to not participate in career technical education, and I think that's okay. I don't think that career technical education and the principles it brings to the table are absolutely necessary for a complete education for every person in the world. And I think when we try to say that unless we're serving every single student, then somehow we're not offering what we need to offer, then we get ourselves in trouble, because we tend to compromise the integrity of our programs and therefore make what we bring to the table not as valuable.
Student should participate in career technical as in every student should take welding. That's not what I mean. I'm looking at the whole continuum of career and technical education that includes career exploration, career orientation, as well as occupational specific programs, professional education. I'm talking about the whole continuum, not just everybody needs to pick a program and enroll in it. No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
Right. And I think that's the dilemma sometimes, is how we structure programs, and I guess the caution I would have, as Daryl put it, would be to try to create something that is so generic that it meets everybody's needs, and thereby lose the essence of what makes the enterprise valuable in the first place. Yes, sir.
What I interpreted from your comments, and maybe that's not what you meant, but when you use the word all, I interpreted that as being at the exclusion of no one. Not, all-encompassing, but it was open to students of varying ability levels. It was open to students of regardless of gender. It was open to students regardless of whether they had any physical challenges. I didn't interpret your comments as meaning that every student would be included.
The other thing is, though, I do think career technical education, because of the things that it can bring to the table, in that it connects educators with work, I think that we have been able to do a lot of internships, externships with academic teachers and business and industry. Activities that don't really directly address career technical education per se, but have been driven by career technical educators and that enterprise. Also, a lot of the workshops and in-services and curriculum development that have been driven by the career technical education community and philosophy have found their way into academic teaching, and that, in essence, benefits a broader scope of students. So I think in that way we do help other folks indirectly. Yes, sir.
One area that we've been conspicuously
you have one of the lapel mics, so you don't need the other kind.
One of the areas we've been conspicuously silent on has been the whole area of teacher education. Where do they fit into this role?
Well, that's in February, isn't it, boy? We only do one workshop at a time. Well, I tell you what, in the early 90s, late 80s, a tremendous a number of states withdrew direct career technical support to teacher education programs. And I think you saw a precipitous drop off after that in career technical education programs. So I think, frankly, there ought to be a higher level of involvement of a career technical education community with teacher education, because I think that is a absolutely essential component to developing leadership. And if we don't have strong programs there, I think we pay for it at the other end.
Like explain why that was because of further reduction in leadership. Like, I think that's an important point of why that was done.
Good point. Yeah, it wasn't something that we all just sat down one day and decided, well, we're going to cut out support. The federal legislation changed, and we didn't have the kinds of funds to put in. We couldn't use federal money to support teacher education like we had before. And I think our profession is paying for that. In Idaho, we were fortunate enough to be able to shift that support entirely to state money, and so we were able to continue support for teacher education, but all with state funds, and frankly, we haven't been able to keep up with the level of support that we'd like to in that area.
It's a good idea. We don't subsidize English teachers and chemistry teachers and elementary teachers and middle school teachers with federal funds.
Well, I beg to differ. I think we spend a tremendous amount of federal money supporting those teachers, except we do it through the whole general infrastructure, if you will. And what career technical education needs in terms of defining its enterprise, I think is some special focus in that particular area. And granted, we may not have to do it through that mechanism, but we haven't found an alternative.
From one of our national scholars from Idaho, Angie Neal, and she wants to know, what is your thinking on what will be the impact of state exiting standards on the implementation of CTE?
Wait till I get back to Idaho. Exiting standards are absolutely critical, I think, to the educational debate or the educational implementation. Anybody that does not pay attention to academic exiting standards is going to be in trouble. And I think that includes everybody from the PE teacher to the janitor that cleans the school building to the career technical educators, that standards has to be on the horizon, has to be in their vocabulary, and they have to be addressing that. I think the key for career technical education on standards is first that we need to get out. I don't know if get out in front is the correct term because standards are already everywhere, but we have to be proactive in identifying exactly how we contribute to the acquisition of academic standards. I do not think that means that we have to rewrite our entire programs and do away with career technical education and turn all career technical education teachers into remedial English teachers or remedial math teachers. I think it involves identifying what about our enterprise contributes to those standards, but contributes specifically, i.e., what specific standards can we support in our curriculum. And I think there's going to be some need for some crosswalks, in other words, taking the competencies and matching up with the academic standards. I think we need those crosswalks partly because it'll help the career technical teachers and the academic teachers integrate their curriculum and thereby help students achieve better. But I also think it's important politically because I think we have to identify how we contribute to this compelling problem that school administrators are going to face. Because frankly, if you're a school administrator and your kids aren't meeting academic achievement standards, you're going to have to make some changes. And the standard that we use for educational reform is we got a problem, we throw another course after it. Regardless of the fact that this kid has taken math for 8 years or 10 years or whatever many years, we're going to throw another one course at the very end of their career and somehow that's going to solve the problems that they've had for 12 years in school. And I think that if we don't articulate how career technical education helps students meet academic standards, then the fallback position of school administrators is going to be, we got to shut down everything else so we can put in more remedial courses so we can meet these standards. And I think that'll be a real problem for us. So I think academic standards are real important and we have to pay attention to them. Yes?
We have a question from Lisa Foley, and she is with Truckee Meadows Community College Technical Institute, Reno, Nevada. She would like you to define the word career as used in context with technical education. In other words, is it broader than vocational education?
The vision statement, if you will look at it, or this principles and premise that we developed, specifically combines the terms career technical. And in fact, I don't know if on this version it has them combined or not. No, it still has career and technical on this one. But if you look at the web version, it hyphenates the terms. In other words, career technical are combined to a new term, if you will, that defines a what Prosser and envisioned, I think, as vocational education. And to be inclusive of some of those general benefits that focus on careers offers the career technical enterprise. But I think we have to be careful that the career education as envisioned by the movement in the 70s is not what we're talking about in this particular enterprise. We are talking about education that draws its curriculum from the workforce or from the workplace, that prepares students for that workplace, and it's not just a way to get better textbook examples that mean more to students. It has much more content and rigor than that. And so my definition of career education in this sense is a broader, and we use that term, I think, to define a broader vocational education than what the old vocational education term defines, but it is not the same thing as the career education that we looked at in the 70s. Yes, sir. Now, are they getting virtual potato pins for this participation, by the way? Okay, you're sending the websites to them? Well, that's good. Yes, sir.
You've spoken about the contributions to academic programs and the placement in the workforce. What about the role as it relates to participation in additional education in post-secondary? I think you've been focused more on post-secondary in the presentation, but in post-secondary participation and also in higher education.
Let me make sure I understand your question. How does career technical education at the secondary level help participation in post-secondary education?
Or even into higher ed.
Right. Well, I think that in the first place, I think we have to recognize that most people will participate in post-secondary education. Either 2-year certificate level, 4-year programs, doctoral programs, and or continuing education. Once they get in the workforce, they'll probably come back. And so to design an educational program in which we do not prepare people to be able to take advantage of that post-secondary option is to design a program that's obsolete before you start. So I think that the notion that career technical education, particularly at the secondary level, does not need to prepare students to go on to further education is not practical, because most people will have to get into further education as we go along. The problem, and I think everybody's pretty much in agreement with that. I don't find a lot of argument, even much the hardcore Vokies will argue with that particular concept. The problem comes in how we implement that. The first corollary says because people will all go to post-secondary education, we don't need to have any kind of job-specific, career-focused education at the secondary level. That, to me, is a tremendous mistake and a misinterpretation of how the system works. In the first place, that's where the power and the synergy and the benefit of career technical education comes from, is in drawing curriculum from the workforce. And if we divorce ourselves from that, we divorce ourselves from everything that gives us the power, if you will, to affect even the general educational outcomes. So I do not believe that because career technical students at secondary level need post-secondary education. That means we need to do away with even very much in-depth career technical education at the secondary level. On the other hand, we have to prepare students to move on to post-secondary education, and I think statistics indicate, for example, the statistic I shared that at-risk students are 8 to 10 times more likely to stay in secondary ed if they enroll in career technical education. Well, let me tell you, a student who stays in high school is going to be way more likely to be prepared to go on to college than one who drops out. So just from the student motivation retention standpoint, career technical education can serve and benefit and enhance the participation in post-secondary education. I think beyond that, the articulation between and the interaction and the integration of academic skills with career technical skills and academic educators with career technical educators is extremely important, because I think students need to recognize that if they're going to be in auto technology, they have to write well, they have to do math skills well, and the math teacher and the English teacher needs to work with the career technical educator to create educational experiences that will get the student not only those technical skills but those academic skills that they're going to that are necessary for them to succeed in auto technology. Well, the facts are those same skills are the skills they also need to succeed in post-secondary education. And so there's not that clear dividing line that we used to have. So I think career technical educators need to do a better job of recognizing that they need to address all aspects of the industry. They need to take advantage of the incredible learning environment they've been given. And one of the frustrations I have, in fact, Joe shared this today, is that you go into some classrooms and you want to shake somebody because they're not taking advantage of the environment they've been given. They're making this class more boring than the worst class we ever took, and that's because they're not taking advantage of the incredible learning environment. And so in our implementation, if we implement career technical education the way it ought to be, that we will enhance the participation in post-secondary ed. And that deserves a potato pan.
Cynthia Pollock from Pennsylvania would like to know if you had teachers, active teachers in the classrooms or counselors at the table when you were discussing what the director's, national state director's mission would be, or did you only speak to national groups?
The vision statement actually was drawn from the collective experience of all the directors through a variety of different interactions with all kinds of people, which included counselors and classroom teachers and all those sorts of folks. We did not have those groups represented per se at the final drafting stage when we were putting the vision statement together.
Her point is that just it seems like CTE is so divided, and that's part of our problem.
I agree. Any other questions? Yes.
You had made a comment that CTE has not been successful at the national level because it does not have...
Why don't you pick up that microphone?
That it does not have a unified, clear vision. Looking at the looming Perkins bill coming up as far as reappropriation...
Looming is an interesting choice of terms there.
What would be your strategy to make CTAE nationwide unified, and then how do we get that point, I mean, as far as advocacy to the national level? I've had legislative aides say to me when I've been on the Hill, well, you meaning CTAE, you folks don't even have a clear definition of who you are because we've changed names. Now, with that in mind, how do we get our politicians to see this new vision and show them that we are unified?
Well, I'm not naive enough to think that we'll ever get 100% unity, and I think we just have to move beyond that and not worry about it too much. But I do think things like creating a vision statement like this and publishing it and say this represents the collective view of all the state directors of career technical education in the United States is an incredibly important first step. I think we can also bring on our teacher professional organization, the ACTE group, and I think they'll buy into this sort of visioning process, and we need to work closely with them to get that buy-in. Frankly, the two primary lobbyists on capital at the federal level are the National Directors Association and the ACTE. So frankly, even if we can get those two groups to agree and to support each other, which I think they are today and have the last couple of years better than in the past, I think we'll go a long ways towards selling that concept. But just have to keep doing activities like this. We have to keep trying to bring people on board, to get people to buy in, to convince them it's in their own best self-interest to set aside some of the differences and to join together in a clear visioning process and also a marketing process, if you will, so that we can create some legislation. And then finally, I think we have to get access to and work directly with the Office of Vocational and Adult Education, because I think they will have an influence on what that federal legislation looks like. And I think that we need to do more than just say, we want to play too. We've got to come to the table with some help for those folks and some definite direction and some legislation or proposals that they can incorporate. Yes, sir.
There you go. I thought it was a good question.
You want two potato pins?
No, I don't
want
two.
Okay. I'm glad. Yeah, absolutely. You can have two, even before you start.
I'm not a career and technical educator, and I think one problem I have is how the term is defined. I don't think it's communicating well to me when you combine them, or you have a hyphen or not a hyphen. And the idea that it's not the old vocational ed, but it's expanded now with other things, doesn't create an image. I don't know what it is, but I can't put my finger on it. Now I'm outside of the field, and I've tried this on other people. They struggle with it as well. So I think part of it is incumbent on the field. I'm just speaking as a person.
Right.
To get a better definition of what that means other than now it's expanded. I think it is, and I think that has meaning, but the terms aren't conveying, and you're hearing enough on the web and so on, they're not conveying a good sense of what this means. And it's probably something in the terminology, and it's a complicated thing to define. But I have to be honest, I think a lot of people share that. And I think it's a tricky kind of concept.
Right. And I personally agree with you. I think that any term we use, in the first place, it is a complex enterprise. We are actually describing, in the narrow sense, many different things, and we're trying to combine that into a single term. And part of that exercise is there is no perfect term, so part of the exercise is to pick one, anyone, and then sell it and get people used to it, and then attach definitions to it that people then can understand and articulate the concept that I think you're talking about. But I personally agree with that. I personally have a difficult time at times defining that enterprise and saying exactly what it means and what it is at its core.
Scholars in Minnesota who's in a post-secondary institution, and he would like to know how you get faculty buy-in, because it boils down to choices, and if they're going to take technical writing courses versus more of the technical education type programs, how do you get faculty to buy in that those are just as important?
How do you get, which kind of faculty do you think?
He's in a community college, so it's probably his peers, his teaching peers. How do you get them to buy in that their courses are just as important as the other academic courses?
I'm not sure I understand the full complexity of the question. If he's asking how do we get vocational or career technical educators to think that their courses are as important as academic courses.
I think it's the academic faculty.
To think that they're counterparts. Well, right. In the first place, we have to make the courses as valuable. I think that it is a mistake to try to say, I want you to appreciate what I do, when what you do isn't very valuable. And so we have to make sure first that what we're doing in career technical education is indeed of top-notch quality, is indeed meeting the needs of our customers. Frankly, I think at the community college it should be a fairly easy sell. because if you look at the majority of the occupations, if you look at the placement rates, if you look at the success rates, career technical students tend to do very well. Placement rates for career technical education in Idaho is extremely high at the post-secondary level. They get good jobs. They're well-paying jobs. The community of employers appreciates that value. And I think that is, so the first step is that we need to create quality programs. Secondly, we need to document our results, and we need to document in terms of that in educationally meaningful outcomes, i.e., the people that employ our customers like what they get, and our customers, i.e., the students, are benefiting from their education and say, when I get out on the job, I am better prepared because of the courses I took. If we can do that, and then we can share that information with our academic counterparts, I think we can get them on board. I think also if we can get away from this competitive nature in that because what I do is valuable, because what I do is important, that means that what you do is less valuable and what you do is less important, then you're naturally going to have a reaction from your academic counterparts to say, you know, well, no, it isn't what I do is valuable too. And we have to get out of that mode. We have to have a little more synergy in terms of that what I do is valuable, what you do is absolutely essential, not only in and of itself as a discipline, but in terms of what it contributes to what my curriculum has to have to prepare these students to be successful in business and industry. So I think defining our enterprise more clearly, I think making sure that what we do is of sufficient rigor and that warrants support, and then finally collecting information and sharing that in kind of a collaborative, cooperative, affirming, supportive role will help us get to that end.
Don't you think that we live in a culture where there are pre-established values put on various kinds of occupations, and you know, I grew up in vocational education, so I have a different perspective, but I have friends and colleagues who really don't value an automotive technician until their car doesn't start, and then their value goes up significantly until the car is running again, and then, you know, well, they're an automotive technician. So I think it's bigger than just selling. I think it's a whole cultural revolution almost, and I don't know that I'll live long enough to see it.
And I think that is definitely one of the things we deal with, and that's why I think it's important for the career technical education community to at least define itself and understand what they do, and to stay united in selling those approaches, because we do deal with sort of an unrealistic, though it may be, culture that says certain occupations aren't of value. And I agree with you. I don't think we're going to fix that overnight.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rush, for a very insightful presentation, very interesting discussion this afternoon.
I can hear that potato pin.
I won my potato pin, too.
There you go.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming here this afternoon, and those of you joining us via the webcast. Please join us on January the 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The speaker will be George Copa, Project Director of Oregon State University, and the topic will be New Designs for Career Technical Education at Secondary and Post-Secondary Levels. All presentations are archived at www.nccte.org. So, happy holidays to all of you. Feliz Navidad.
And I have some extra pins here.